Hello, everyone. I'm Jill Aitoro with SC Media, and I want to thank you for joining us for the latest video in our series for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I'm really excited to be joined today by Chris Commiskey. Chris is CEO of Commiskey Strategic Solutions. He also is a former government executive, both in federal government as well as state government for many years. He served as Undersecretary for Management at DHS, as well as some other roles at DHS for quite a while. And he was with the state of Arizona for, I think, about 18 years, focusing on IT and really keying into cybersecurity for a very long time. So, Chris, I first want to say thank you so much for being here.
Oh, no, it's great to join you. Thanks, Jill.
Yeah, I've known Chris for years, so it's always fun to be able to catch up and talk to him. I think you wrote a column when I was editor at Federal Times for us for many years. So today I wanted to chat with you because, as I mentioned, it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, October. And I was interested because CISA actually always comes up with a theme, which is great. And this year, they were really kind of keying into the people factor of cyber, you know, what we need or hope people can take ownership of in terms of enabling cybersecurity. But I've kind of been looking at this in terms of what is actually realistic, because people will be people. And I think the user community can sometimes really be influenced by human nature. So it's hard to put too much in the hands of just users themselves. One of the key pillars that they talk about, CISA talked about in terms of enabling this, is the supply chain and software security. So I wanted to chat with you about that, looking through the lens of government in particular, if we can. First and foremost, when you were in government, state, but certainly federal, you know, I'm sure the supply chain was a great focus of attention in terms of security. We hear about it more now than I feel like we did then. So how has it changed in the years since you were in government in terms of expectations to enable security across the supply chain?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that over time, there's been much more of an emphasis and focus on the supply chain, particularly as it relates to software in more recent years. When you get these kind of tangible attacks like SolarWinds or Log4j, you know, it gives an impetus to government to act. As you know, as a student of government yourself, it's often reactive to events as opposed to getting out in front of things. And so Congress, or when I was in the state legislature, oftentimes, you know, something would happen and then there would be a reaction to it and the funding would flow and then, you know, the capabilities would be put in place. And so I think that you're seeing much more activity around that. Certainly at the federal level, recently, you know, the EO last year that was issued really had a special place in it for the supply chain, you know, talking about software bill of materials or, you know, some kind of a scaling system so that you could say, okay, these products are compliant or not. And even more recently, I think you're seeing OMB put out policy directives to the agencies saying you will, you know, require software vendors that are providing product to the government to meet certain thresholds in self-attestation. So you're seeing a lot more activity of late, where I think CISA is kind of at the core of a lot of that activity.
Yeah. And, you know, what's interesting, you know, when we talk about this topic of security awareness is you don't necessarily think of the supply chain as an area where it's very directly influenced by the user. But, you know, whether you're talking about configurations and integrations and usage of this various software applications, I do think it factors in. So what is the balance? And when you talk about supply chain of technology enablement versus reliance on user action?
Yeah, so there's so much of this sits behind the scenes, right? When you're talking about a lot of the software updating and the logging capabilities, like you saw with these recent attacks, that's not something the user particularly would, you know, be on the front lines of. And so I think there's kind of a dual-sided coin on this. One is you've got to be able to detect and respond to more insidious attacks using your own software supply chain, like we saw with SolarWinds, where, you know, most government agencies are using this as a patching mechanism. And so you know, they're going to do patching. You tell them you got to do patching, they do it, and then it, you know, the infiltration occurs. And then there's the user side of it, you're seeing much more activity in that space around, requiring multi-factor authentication, or, adding steps to access certain data that I think is much more visible to the user today than it has been ever before. I mean, even just in your practical everyday applications, whether it's, looking at your MyCharge or paying your cable bill, even the external folks are using MFA to, force another step of security. And governments, have been kind of hit and miss in terms of adding those steps. So I think users are going to see a much more visible aspect when it comes to multi-factor, or other mechanisms to require them to take steps to gain even more sensitive data within the enterprise.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes when you're talking about software applications, there's the question of whether a user can dodge some of those security standards that are there to ensure compliance with certain requirements, and to ensure prevention of various access by bad actors. I feel like government has the potential, or certainly strives to be more secure, more diligent in terms of not allowing of those kind of dodging of best practices. But from your perspective, is that an issue in government, or is that something we more see in corporate America?
Well, I think that the corporate folks I work with seem to be taking it much more seriously. They're much more aggressive about the infrastructure changes to get to zero trust architecture and things of that nature. With the government agencies, as you've seen through the years, the legacy system on top of legacy system, and the inability to, fund things in a kind of a serial fashion. You're just kind of like, okay, we're going to spend money here, and then it's not connected to other spends or appropriations. And so it just kind of builds organically. And so I think that's what you see with the government, because the funding is inconsistent. They're governed by CRs. Oftentimes it's like, just keep the thing running. And then you'll, from OMB, you'll get a lot of direction, right? There'll be a lot of guidance that comes out saying do X, Y, and Z, but the funding doesn't necessarily match up to that. So I think that's kind of the challenge for agencies today is, they've got so many things that they're required to do. What can you do in a serious fashion to execute against all these directives so that you actually get progress?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a make it work scenario in government. Speaking more generally, as we do look at something like awareness within the workforce, the user community, how much from your own memory and like what you see now as a consultant, how much cybersecurity training and workforce awareness is driven down to the throughout the workforce and government agencies, civilian in particular? Do they have a ways to go, or do you feel like at this point it's very top of mind across the federal workforce?
Well, I think they've made some strides, and certainly the CIO and the CISO and the CDO roles, at least in some of the national security agencies I work with, has been elevated to the point where they're a much more direct report to not only the management function of the department or agency, but also up the chain to the COO, the GIPRA COO, which is typically the number two, like a DHS, the deputy secretary. And so you're seeing more visibility move up the chain. And so people are talking more about Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and what needs to happen with the users to drive more effective messaging, because we know that it's just one click on some of these text messages now or emails that's going to allow for a phishing attack to get underway. And so I think there is an awareness, but the churn in the workforce is such that you've really got to stay on top of it, and sometimes that can be a difficult task when you're constantly having to orientate more folks into the systems.
Yeah, what's the proper balance in your mind between reliance on the user community, following best practices, doing so to speak what they're told from a security perspective, versus finding technological means to manage it for them? I mean, what kind of expectations and ownership should we be placing on the user community?
Yeah, I think a general awareness is probably key. I don't know that you can really say, okay, the network, the crown jewels are going to be protected by the users that aren't, necessarily tasked with that as part of their day-to-day job responsibilities. I think you've got to have, some user participation and awareness, but really, having layered defenses within the tent is probably going to be your best, protection, so that the most sensitive data requires additional access, system requirements and cybersecurity standards, then your general garden variety documents are being exchanged. And so having that kind of an infrastructure is probably going to be more successful than asking the user to kind of sort between that, because then that kind of comes into the insider threat program kind of a matrix where you're like, okay, you're asking them to do these things, but there's a lot of difference of access across the enterprise.
It's interesting too, because government, I feel like, has always had this challenge of maintaining classified information, of course, and the need to exchange, thanks to historic events, 9/11 and others. We've come to learn that across agencies, there needs to be efficient means of exchanging information while also maintaining security. There's a lot of times that does have to do with how users manage the transfer of information. Have we perfected that model yet? Are we, at the point where, government and agencies are effectively sharing as is needed without compromising security?
Well, I think we've got a ways to go on information sharing. I think it's aspirational in a lot of respects. Even with state and local governments, using the ISACs and the different mechanisms, the fusion centers. So there are levels of government where the information sharing is effective, but you do have clearance limitations in some of those places who can actually receive that information. I think that CISA is trying to get more folks in the regions that are cleared and able to discuss this with local and state governments, which is helpful. Yeah. But ultimately, whether it's rebuilding HISN at DHS or other mechanisms for sharing information, I think they've still got a ways to go in terms of making sure that the right folks have the right information at the right time. As we've seen in the past, that can be difficult across agencies in the federal space, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, thank you, Chris. I think we are out of time, but thank you for being here. And, I guess happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.